This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Have you or someone you know struggled with alcohol use? A recent study by the National Institutes of Health and Research Triangle International has found a staggering increase in alcohol consumption by women in the first wave of the pandemic. Women with young children have seen a 323% increase in drinking. Yet, average alcohol consumption has been climbing long before the pandemic. Today, Where We Live, we'll hear the stories of 3 Connecticut women in recovery. And later, we'll talk to a Yale physician specializing in addiction medicine. We also want to hear from you. Are you or a loved one in recovery for excessive alcohol use? You can join us, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can share a comment on our Facebook page or find us on Twitter at Where We Live. Joining us first on Zoom today is Kathleen Callahan. She's a Stratford, Connecticut resident. Kathleen, welcome to our show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this morning.
Now, I understand you've been sober for 10 years. So can you tell us a little bit about your story? When did you first begin to use alcohol?
Yes, and it's coming up on 10 years. Well, I was raised in Stamford, and I was one of 6 children, the first of 3 girls after 3 boys. And before I get to when I started, my story's intertwined with so many others. I won't go deep into that other than to say that over the years, with hard work and forgiveness, my loved ones and I have processed together and moved forward. But I will share that I was both incredibly fortunate and significantly damaged. I experienced trauma early on in my life and again in early adulthood, and I carried those secrets for decades due to both suppression and then guilt and shame. So with that said, my exposure to drinking happened sometime around 7 or 8 years old. We grew up in a neighborhood filled with children. It was the 70s, and there was a lot of wild behavior going on. So I would say 7 or 8 was my first drink.
Wow. I'm sorry to hear that you had those experiences growing up. And so when we think about access to alcohol, looking back, did you see that your use was tied to helping you cope with what was happening to you?
I honestly don't think I can say that. I know that I behaved the way I did throughout my life and began drinking because of who I was, where I lived, the family I was in. I don't know if at that age I was trying to cope. Later on, for sure, as things were revealed to me, as my memory started to come back. But my father owned a liquor store. My parents were wonderful. They provided a safe, caring, nurturing home for us. Again, the tumult of the 70s and the experimentation with alcohol and drugs throughout our neighborhood, throughout our community was rampant at the time. I can go to meetings now and see many people I grew up with. So I just think that it was available. And as kids in the neighborhood found it, it didn't matter if you were younger, you were exposed to it as well.
So as you approached adulthood, what happened? And when did you understand that you had a problem?
Well, I think back now, and I think it's really wild for me to think that I haven't had an alcohol drink in almost a decade. And it's stranger to believe that 40 years passed between my first and last drink. That's where I am now. That seems hard to believe. There was 35 years really of drinking, and 25 of them were hard drinking, and my last 10 years were daily drinking. And I ran from it, and the admission of it did impact my family, my older brothers, and I didn't want to be like that. I was raised strong-willed and fearless, and I could take care of everything. And I think part of what happened to me younger enforced that I had to take care of myself. So I think that I ran from it for a very long time. I remember going to a meeting early on and to celebrate someone's 5-year anniversary, and I knew then, and that was in my 20s. I had a disastrous early marriage, and which was verbally abusive, and I knew then. I knew I was escaping my drinking by marrying him. He did not drink. So I knew, but I couldn't get a handle on it at all. And I had, multiple diagnoses through therapy and multiple admissions for treatment and multiple relapses. So it was a very long path for me. But the last 10 years and surely the last 2.5 years of my drinking was when I knew, I finally admitted, and that was in my mid-40s.
So what was the turning point, Kathleen?
The turning point was 2.5 years before I stopped drinking. I was rushed to the hospital with acute pancreatitis and alcoholic hepatitis. And the doctors at Yale emergency room told me that I would have 6 months to live if I continued drinking the way I was. Shockingly, I drank for another 2.5 years, and I'm here today with all of you. The turning point after many different admissions to treatment and tries at 12-step programming was my last admission. The day before my last admission to treatment, I was outside of Minneapolis, in the plains west of Minneapolis, and I was a little early for my intake, early in the morning, and I was sitting in a parking lot nearby the treatment center at a train station, and I was still drinking, and I thought about walking onto those train tracks, and at that moment, I realized that I wasn't afraid to die, and that really scared me, that I wasn't afraid to die. And I then realized that, all the people who had been supporting me, all the loved ones who I had taken hostage over the last decade, they believed in me. And maybe with all the seeds that had been planted over the years, that maybe recovery was for me as well.
Well, Kathleen, we're glad to be talking with you today and hearing your story, because we know that everyone has a different story and treatment options can vary. So what worked for you?
Well, what worked for me was to be completely away from alcohol for a while. I had to be put away. I had to be isolated from alcohol. And what helped me was gender-specific programming. My trauma, all of it throughout the life was gender-based. And while my responses may not have been, they were by my personality and who I am, my treatment had to be gender-based. And even to this day, the women that I walk in recovery and outside of recovery are tremendous supports, and we lift each other up all the time. So I definitely needed to dig in. I don't know if everybody needs to tell their stories of their childhood. I did. And I needed to understand the value of connection, because I was trying to do life on its own with me being my own God, my own director of my life. So working with other women and being removed from the opportunity for alcohol. So my last day was, I knew when I went in that it would be the last, because I had been away enough time. So, due to blessings beyond my control and my complete acceptance of addiction and the support of women, Grace elided on December 21st, 2011. And I say grace because I was afforded the hope and courage to try again. And I finally found some faith that I could face the future and find joy and meaning.
You're hearing Kathleen Callahan here on Where We Live. She lives in Connecticut. She's going on 10 years sober as we talk with women in recovery from excessive alcohol use. We're talking about this today because researchers say that this problem has skyrocketed during the pandemic, especially among women in the first wave, but it was growing even before this public health crisis. I wanted to bring in another perspective. On Zoom with us is Beverley Brakeman. She's a West Hartford resident. Beverley, welcome to our show.
Hi, Lucy. Thank you.
It's really powerful to hear Kathleen share her story with us. And I wanted to learn about you as well. Tell us about how long you've been sober.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kathleen, for sharing your story. I really appreciate that. And thanks for doing the show. So I have been sober for 31 years. I started drinking when I was 16. It's a long story, but basically, not unlike Kathleen, it was sort of growing up. I was awkward, uncomfortable, embarrassed by my appearance, voice, thoughts, ideas, everything. And, after discovering alcohol around in my teens, it was kind of a game changer. All of a sudden I was pretty, I was desirable, I was smart, all those things. So, but it got worse, got a lot worse.
And so tell us about the turning point for you when you realized that you had a problem and you needed some treatment.
I think it was, many years of drinking, and my disease really started to progress to the point where I was a blackout drinker. So I was doing a lot of things drunk and not remembering them. I was really it was pretty dangerous. I would black out for long periods of time and, hurt myself a lot. And even though people were concerned about me, I was pretty good at dodging their concerns, and I was quite functional. So after, I don't know, about 10 years of drinking like that, I was also struggling with depression and anxiety. And I sort of had a moment that I just realized I was never going to have the life I wanted if I kept drinking.
Mm. And so I mentioned to Kathleen that treatment can look very different depending on the individual. So can you talk about the treatment that helped you, the programs that helped you?
Yeah. So, so a lot of people in the program don't have like a moment where they, in a lot of alcoholic women don't necessarily have a moment. For me, I did. It was sort of sitting in a bar by myself. I just had this experience of complete dread that I just was never going to, if I kept drinking, my life was going to end, or I was going to end it myself. So for me, what worked is, because I was concurrently being treated with a therapist for really severe depression, it was a lot of talk therapy. I'm a very high maintenance alcoholic. And at that time, Prozac had just come out. And even though I'll be the first to tell you, I think we over medicate with psych meds, it was a life changer for me. And then, I got involved in a 12-step program of recovery. And, I'm happy to tell you a little bit about the stages of that, if you'd like.
Yes, please, Beverly.
So sort of 12 steps. The first steps really are about grasping the hard reality for me that I just couldn't drink anymore. And then my life was absolutely a complete mess, and I had no power over alcohol at all. And I had to admit I had a problem. And then even harder was sort of building a spiritual foundation, so that I felt like I had something bigger than me to rely on. And I didn't always believe in a God or higher power, I think, but I do today. The next set of steps are really about looking inward at yourself and looking at your resentments, your bad behavior, your hurtful actions towards your defenses of character. And this is really important, because I believe it's hard not to go back to drinking if you don't offload your resentments, and really look in at yourself at the way you've hurt other people and in turn yourself. So it's really about self-forgiveness. And then sort of the next part is cleaning up your side of the street. Like, okay, so let's get honest with yourself. How many people did I hurt? A lot. How many things did I hurt? How many, animals did I run over? That was one of my stories that was really awful. And then, making amends to those people and making your life right. And it's as much for them as it is for you. Because sometimes they're like, yeah, whatever, I don't even remember that. But it's really about living your life in a more gracious, honest, and with integrity. And then the last step is sort of like what we're doing here today, which is talking about letting other women know that there are lots of us out here who will hear your story. We won't be surprised by your story. We will protect your anonymity. We will protect your story. And we will do everything we can to help you, because this is a fellowship of, based on love and support and recovery. And alcoholism is a disease that does look different on women, and it impacts us in different ways. And so I'm really glad you're doing this story. But the last thing I'll say is 31 years is a lot of sobriety. But to be honest, what far more inspires me is the woman with 3 days, 3 weeks, 60 days, 90 days. That's what inspires me and keeps me sober.
I'm glad you brought that up, Beverly, because when we think about recovery, is this a lifelong journey?
For me, absolutely. Like the 12 steps that I just sort of went through, you can apply them to so many parts of your life, because I'm an addict, so I don't drink alcohol anymore, but trust me when I tell you, I can go over the top on exercise, food, relationships, you name it. I'm sort of hardwired in that way. So these steps really, really work for me. and you revisit them. For me, I revisit them all the time, and I stay active with other women alcoholics who I love, and who I know have my back. And I have a lot of men alcoholics in my life that have helped me stay sober over the years. So if anybody's listening to this, you are not alone.
Kathleen Callahan, I wanted to go back to you to ask you again, when we think about your story and the importance of sharing it, do you think it helps confront that stigma that other people struggling with alcohol use encounter from people they know?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you, Beverly, for all your words and speaking out. I agree that this work is lifetime. And that's part of the stigma, confronting the stigma, is that I knew that my disease was not purely about alcohol. It was about more things. I never had enough. And I think that hearing different stories and different pathways that people enter addiction, live in addiction, and move out of addiction, it's very unique and individualized. So I think it's really important for all of us to share our stories. I'm very active with other women, and I actually had the opportunity to learn how to train in a healing trauma curriculum, and it's similar to working with other women in a 12-step situation, to see people grow and recognize why they did what they did, and to remove that shame, because I think stigma is what society is doing, keeping us back, but our own internal shame, which I think is such a wasted emotion, is what keeps us from, it's our secrets, and it's that we think we're worse. So any of us that can talk, get this stuff out into the sunlight, and kill the bad and let the good grow.
Kathleen, I also think that there's mixed messages in our society, right? Where people may judge others who are dealing with addiction, but when it comes to drinking, it's socially acceptable. People sometimes don't see it as a big deal. And so how do we confront those mixed messages that we send?
Well, I think, for a long time, I've changed careers in the path of my recovery. I was a software engineer for over 2 decades. And when I came into recovery, I eventually went back and got my associates in drug and alcohol counseling, and then my master's in social work, so that I could do some of this work. And I think initially treatment obviously is important for the people that are already diagnosed and have issues that require that level of care. But my work now focuses on the young people, young girls specifically, but of course boys, anybody that thinks that it is okay. We have found that if you can hold off initiation, the first drink, from the age 14 to 21, every year that you hold off reduces the chance of a problem. Our brains are still developing. So if we can do that in a preventative way and with early interventions, we'll have less people that have this life-threatening disease. But I think in schools, families, friends, we have to talk about it. I know that in my household growing up, that my parents didn't drink, even though my dad had the liquor store, he didn't drink much, but it was around us and it was socially acceptable. And I don't know if PSAs work so much as younger people going into the schools and talking about it. I am trained in screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment for adolescents. And that is a harm reduction, very kind way to just plant seeds and highlight the good that is possible in your life if you're not drinking as much. And I have to say, the binge drinking in college, as big of a problem as it is, and the drinking and drugging that kids experience in younger years, isn't as widespread as many think. And to share that and normalize that it's okay to not drink, and it's okay that if you want to get good grades and continue your sports and your extracurricular activities, that's okay. And to reinforce the positives while it's okay if you're drinking, make sure you have a driver, make sure that you have someone to support you, to slowly plant seeds.
Well, it's been wonderful to hear from you and Beverly, and the openness that you've shared with our listeners about your recovery. Kathleen Callahan and Beverley Brakeman, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we continue our conversations with women in recovery. And later, we hear from a doctor specializing in addiction medicine. You can join us too, 888-720-9677, 888-720-WNPR, or share a comment on our Facebook page, or find us on Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're talking about a problem that's growing among women, and that's excessive alcohol use. A recent National Institutes of Health study found in the first wave of the pandemic, alcohol consumption grew among Black people, people with children, and those with mental health problems. And the largest increases were seen among women with children younger than 5. We want to continue to talk to women in recovery, and joining us now on Zoom is Amanda Aronson, owner of Aronson Consulting in West Hartford. She's also a school board member in the town. Amanda, welcome to our show.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me and for highlighting this really important topic.
Now, I know that you've been sober for more than 7 years, and now you're working with women through your consulting firm to also help them overcome their alcohol consumption issues. So talk about how you've been doing that and how you met your own recovery.
Well, thank you. I do work with women as part of my work. Some of the work I do involves people who want to manage sober living, but I work with women who really want to take their personal and professional development seriously. And we do that through some strategic planning. So it's not just about their recovery, but it might be about managing some of the other aspects of their lives, because in my experience, that is really part of this process of recovery. My recovery story, I think, started when I started drinking in high school socially. But my recovery story really started when I was a senior in college, and I paid my way through school. So I was working full time. I was a full-time student, and I really had it in my mind that I didn't want to miss anything. So I was going to work hard, play hard. And throughout that time, I started to buckle under the stress. I picked up some really bad habits. I would isolate at the end of the night and relax as a reward for myself at the end of the day. And I would listen to music and write and drink. And I got closer and closer to drug use over the years that I was in school. I had to stop my education on 2 occasions to save up my tuition money, and really experienced what it's like to be completely by myself on my own. And I entered basically a downward spiral where by my senior year, I was thriving academically, but I was personally in crisis. And a professor of mine actually helped me break that cycle. And he taught me coping skills. He taught me how to use them. And I was able to enter into the adult part of my life free from drug use. But it really showed me how fast my life could go from fine to not fine, and that I could interrupt that cycle. So for the next part of my life, I was drinking socially, going to weddings, girls' weekends, binge drinking for sure on those occasions. I had a lot of fun, but I still hung on to that end of the night where everyone else's night would be done and I would stay up and I would relax with drinking. I loved that feeling of going numb and having that time all to myself. And it really felt like a reward for me.
And Amanda, I was wondering, when we heard from the other women, there were different turning points for them and different programs that helped them. And so what was your turning point? Where did you turn for help?
My turning point was really when I had, my children were probably 7 and 9. And as the years had gone on, I noticed that, that isolation had really taken hold, and I was numbing with alcohol, and it was fine for a long time. But when I think my kids were about that age, I realized that my habits were starting to change. I was starting to hide my drinking from my husband. I was starting to change some of the habits, and it really scared me. The volume was increasing. And I just looked myself in the eye one day and I knew that I was not ready. That if something happened to my husband or something happened to my kids or something happened in the world that was serious, that I was going to turn to alcohol to cope with it. And I talked to my husband and I told him what was going on. You know, I didn't drink when I was pregnant with our children, and I had tried stopping for about a year on different occasions, but I could never get past a year. My body just craved the alcohol. It wasn't like that with drugs, but it was like that with alcohol. And he just dropped everything that he was doing and rearranged everything. We found, I didn't feel like I needed to go into detox or to go to an outpatient facility, but there was a place called Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health in the Berkshires, and they had an addiction and recovery workshop that was going on. And we told our kids that I was going on a trip, and I went.
And so describe that for us. What was it about that experience that helped you get the drinking under control, or for you to be sober now for 7.5 years?
Well, I think it first and foremost, it was a place that I had been before. I had gone to Kripalu for retreats on a couple of occasions. So it was a place I was really comfortable. I felt at ease there. I knew what to expect, and I trusted the programming that went on in that community. So to enter into a 5-day intensive recovery conference, I felt like I could trust whatever they were going to tell me, and I could just do whatever they suggested. And it really normalized the process of recovery. I didn't understand what recovery was. You know, I had tried to stop drinking before, but I had never tried to recover. And recovery is a very active daily process. And it really, I heard my story and other people's stories. It normalized meetings in the 12-step program of recovery for people who wanted to try that. I had tried that once before on my own, and I found it very overwhelming. I didn't know what to expect, but in this setting, I could experience that and have that normalized for me before I came home and tried to utilize some of that programming.
When we talk about alcohol use among women, is this a hidden problem? And what do you think about that personally? And what do you hear from women that are also in your network that are also in recovery?
Well, what I hear, yes, it is a very hidden problem, especially for women. You know, there's this idea that people in recovery are the weakest among us, and that has not been my experience. You know, people in recovery are the strongest among us because they're dedicating themselves to their health. And it is a very hard process, and it's an incredibly rewarding one. But women go through so many different stages. You know, especially for women when they have children, you go through an incredible identity shift. You know, our society does not value the raising of children, whether it's in a child care setting or in a home setting. And that is a very unshakable process for a lot of women. And we are in a process where, you know, most of us are trying to do more than we really can manage. And stress, we just succumb to it. That, and every time you turn around, you know, if someone is telling you that everything will be fine if you just have a drink at the end of the day, which is what most people are doing when their kids go to bed, who experience the downward spiral that I did. You know, that's not an uncommon story.
You know, there's been a lot of attention on prescription drug use over the years and how to help people. But when we think about alcohol use disorder, people struggling with consuming excessive amounts of alcohol, you know, what supports are there for people in the community? Because sometimes there are financial barriers. Maybe someone, you know, their insurance only will pay for a certain amount of days. And so they're in this cycle of trying to get help, but needing more than just a 10 or 20-day program.
Well, I guess my My recovery didn't necessarily rely on that. I know a lot of people who have found tremendous support through getting medication at times when they needed it, and they determined when those times were. My recovery has been grounded more in putting support systems in place for myself. I definitely I love my therapist. I found that the biggest help is to see her when things are going well. So I do that on a regular basis. I exercise 6 days a week. I'm a New Englander, so I have a sport I love for every season, and that keeps me active, keeps me moving. I worked with a naturopath over the years to try to dial down on my nutrition, and really stabilized and rebuilt my body from the inside out. That I had a lot of struggles with nutrients that were deficient, and I didn't realize how that was affecting my mood. So there's a lot of things that you can do to support yourself in recovery that are just those daily first things first habits: eat, sleep, exercise, therapy. Some of the things that we all try to do, but in recovery, you do them with a lot of intention. And I found the first 2 years of my recovery, I did utilize a 12-step program. I wasn't in the program the way that others may define that, but I certainly found that to be an incredible, incredible support, especially with other women in a gender-based way, as Kathleen mentioned.
Well, we're glad to hear that you're doing well today, Amanda, and that you're helping so many others through your work. Amanda Aronson, again, is a West Hartford resident. She's owner of Aronson Consulting. Thank you for sharing your story with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're going to continue talking after the break, and we'll be hearing from an addiction medicine physician. You can join us too. Are you or someone you love in recovery? What programs helped you? What supports do you think are still needed? You can join us, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we've been talking with Connecticut women in recovery from excessive alcohol use, this problem rising among women even before the pandemic. Joining us now on Zoom is Dr. Jeanette Tetrault, a Yale medicine physician and professor, also program director of the Addiction Medicine Fellowship at Yale School of Medicine. Jeanette, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you to Beverley, Kathleen, and Amanda for sharing their stories and shedding light on this important topic.
I wanted to start with the National Institutes for Health, that recent study showing that alcohol consumption has really skyrocketed, especially among women. What have you noticed among your women patients and some of the factors here?
Yeah, so I certainly, as you've noted, this has been recognized before the pandemic hit, but certainly reached increasing proportions during the first wave of the pandemic and ongoing, where using alcohol to cope from social isolation, increased demands, both in the home and working from home and schooling from home, have really caused increases among women who drink. And many women experiencing, complications related to excessive alcohol use, including the development of alcohol use disorder.
Tell us about the health conditions that women who are drinking excessively, what they are experiencing that's very different from men.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's been highlighted here in some of the stories that we've heard this morning. But certainly there's significant ties between underlying mental health conditions and alcohol use and other substance use. And so untreated, these two situations really exacerbate each other. And we see this often in women. In terms of complications, outside of mental health conditions, there certainly are medical conditions. Kathleen talked about presenting to the emergency department with pancreatitis and alcoholic hepatitis, other gastroenterology related complications resulting from excessive alcohol use. And we see this happen more often in women for multiple reasons. One is women have different levels of volumes of distribution, body water, but also there are differences in the metabolism between men and women of alcohol. So women are at higher risk of experiencing complications related to alcohol than men.
So we've been focusing on the numbers to frame this show, this idea that many more women are drinking excessively. But when we say that, what are we talking about? I mean, how many drinks a day or a week is seen as excessive that can lead to these conditions, Dr. Tetrault?
Sure. So we define binge drinking in women as 4 or more drinks on occasion, or 5 or more drinks on occasion in men. And heavy or excessive drinking is really defined as 8 or more drinks per week in women and 15 or more drinks a week in men. So these binge drinking and heavy drinking definitions really should give us pause to think about our alcohol patterns and look at how alcohol may be affecting our lives and our relationships, our work life, etc.
Can we talk about access to care? This was something I brought up also with Amanda, and we heard from the other women, different programs, different treatments help them, but in terms of, accessing care and, how much it can cost for someone who goes into a residential treatment center for excessive alcohol use, there is an out-of-pocket expense. And so as a society, how do we confront that problem as well? People who want to get better, but, there are financial barriers for them.
Sure. Yeah, no, I really appreciate that question. And, just based on the stories that we've heard today, there's really no one size fits all treatment. And so being mindful of that, many of the women on the show this morning talked about having support systems in place and, exploring different options. And, we recognize that sometimes people have multiple treatment episodes before they are able to achieve their goals. I think an underutilized resource is your primary care provider. And, speaking with them about what's going on, what you are recognizing. Many folks, have recognized they are starting to lose control over their alcohol use. And if that's occurring, you should be able to speak with your provider without the shame and stigma that has been discussed on this show, and work to really establish some goals. And then your provider should help you then find the right treatment. In our, where I work in the Yale program in addiction medicine, we have a motto: there should be no wrong door to treatment for any patient accessing the healthcare system.
You're hearing Dr. Jeanette Tetrault here on Where We Live. She's a Yale medicine physician, professor, program director of the Addiction Medicine Fellowship at Yale School of Medicine. As we talk about excessive alcohol use among women, the numbers are rising. Dr. Tetrault, wondering when we think about the health conditions that women have unique to men when they are consuming large amounts of alcohol, that's leading to increased numbers of hospitalizations. And what have you seen in the pandemic?
Yeah, most certainly. I mean, we are certainly seeing our hospital beds fill up, not just because of COVID, right? People are coming in with complications related to alcohol use at higher rates. There's, as I mentioned, concerns about, increased drinking, but also development of alcohol use disorder, where it's really loss of control, significant consequences, and physiologic phenomenon related to alcohol. And we're certainly seeing that presenting in the hospital settings. Also, other substance use has also increased during this time.
So when we hear alcohol use disorder, is that the same as the term alcoholism? Can you define that for us?
Yeah, so alcohol use disorder is really a set of criteria that we look at, and for folks who've recognize that alcohol may be impacting their life, we use criteria to define whether someone has an alcohol use disorder, and it falls into three general domains. If they're experiencing physiologic consequences, meaning they experience withdrawal symptoms, or notice they need to drink more alcohol to get the desired effect. If they notice they're losing control over their alcohol use. So while it may have been controlled at one point, now they really can't control it. And then the other general domain is continued alcohol use despite consequences, despite harm. And so when we sort of look at these criteria, the more of these 11 criteria that an individual is experiencing, the more severe we consider their alcohol use disorder.
And you mentioned earlier that the first stop in seeking out help, it can be the chat with the primary care physician. So when you look at this research that shows that alcohol use has been growing even before the pandemic, how does that messaging change at the doctor's office? The communication that the doctor needs to have with the patient, especially when we know people haven't been staying routine with their checkups in this pandemic. How do you reach your patients with these very important messages?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, Kathleen brought up early on in the show an approach called screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment. And so I think what that does is normalize providers asking patients about substance use, about alcohol and other substance use, utilizing techniques for folks who may be ambivalent about change to motivate them to either change their drinking behaviors or seek treatment, and really making sure that our providers understand the evidence base related to treatment of alcohol use disorder and how this may differ among men and women, and knowing what the referral sources are. So I think those are the main things. And a lot of that starts with education and community understanding.
Mm. Again, we're talking to Dr. Jeanette Tetrault here on Where We Live. She's a physician and professor and program director of the Addiction Medicine Fellowship at Yale School of Medicine. If you have a comment or a question as we talk about a recovery, the number 888-720-9677. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Earlier in the show, I asked the women who shared their stories with us about the mixed messages that our society puts out there. Even when we hear, red wine, drinking red wine helps with heart health, or, oh, if you're stressed out, just have a drink, you'll feel better. And so how do we confront all those messages, Dr. Tetrault?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are certain, there are certain times in one's life that alcohol should not be consumed at all, right? So pregnant women, before, young adulthood, before age 21. These are times when we really should be really careful with our messaging, and work with folks who may still be engaging under those circumstances. Outside of that, there's really no healthy reason to drink alcohol. It's more, reducing harm. And again, this is a topic that Kathleen brought up earlier that I firmly believe in, which is we should focus on any particular harms that a patient is experiencing related to their substance use and work with them to achieve the goals that they're looking for. So currently, the recommendations are to either engage in no alcohol consumption, or for women, less than 1 drink per day.
When we think about treatment and the different paths that people can take, I mean, do you have guidelines for women patients on which path to take that is best for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, treatment should be individualized. There is no one size fits all. And so, again, this is where the primary care provider can be very impactful because they know the patient's history, kind of above and beyond the presentation with alcohol use. So for women who have underlying mood and anxiety disorder, and that's intertwined with their alcohol use, certainly thinking about treatments for alcohol that are also focused on caring for their underlying mental health. We talked a lot about intertwining of alcohol use and trauma, and really thinking about trauma-informed care when we approach patients with alcohol use. I think one of the things we haven't talked a lot about on this show is the impact of medications, and there are medications that can really help with cravings. And so this may be an important component of care for some patients, and has a strong evidence base behind it.
And we only have a couple of minutes left, but can you name some of the medications that you subscribe for your patients that can help them?
Sure. Naltrexone is probably the most widely studied and has the best evidence base behind it. Can reduce cravings from alcohol. That comes in an oral and an injectable form. There are other medications. One is called camprosate. And there's also disulfiram, or Antabuse, which many people have heard about, which is much more of a deterrent, doesn't really address cravings.
Well, again, we really appreciate your time here on the show. Dr. Jeanette Tetrault, a physician and professor, also program director of the Addiction Medicine Fellowship at Yale School of Medicine. I thought it was really powerful to hear from these women who shared their stories. And when we think about how to address stigma, Dr. Tetrault, I'm wondering if you could just end on the importance of hearing people and not judging them, because we all have different paths our lives take.
Yeah, so I firmly believe stigma is one of the biggest threats to health overall. And so, I think providers certainly need to leave their stigma at the door when they're coming into medical settings. Additionally, I think there's a great deal of importance in the education system, the medical education system and the public education system, about substance use in general and alcohol use, normalizing, allowing folks to recognize, and Beverley referred to this as a lifelong disease, and recognizing that there is help out there. There are people who can help you, and support is important. Healthcare providers are important, leaving that stigma and shame behind from the part of the provider is of the utmost importance to make a change for individuals.
We appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show is produced by Sujata Srinivasan. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. We'll be back tomorrow to talk about movements to take back prim-trimmed lawns, to help native plants and pollinators, also to provide stopovers for migrating birds. On the next Where We Live, we dig into the trends of delawning and rewilding. Ecologist and entomologist Doug Tallamy joins us. We hope you do as well.